This is the moment the entire story of this war flipped upside down. For 3 years, the world watched the United States ship weapons into Ukraine. Billions of dollars worth of Patriot missiles, HIMARS rocket systems, artillery shells, armored vehicles, loaded onto planes, driven across borders, handed over to a country that was fighting for its survival. America was the supplier. Ukraine was the receiver. That was the deal. That was the dynamic everyone understood. Not anymore. If you look at what is happening right now in the defense corridors of Washington, you will see something that would have sounded completely impossible in 2022. The United States is signing deals to buy weapons from Ukraine. The country that was once collecting donated equipment from foreign warehouses is now selling its own battlefield-tested systems to the most powerful military on Earth. And the price tag being discussed is not small. We are talking about $50 billion. As of April 2026, Ukraine's defense industry, which was worth barely $1 billion when the war began, has grown into a $55 billion production machine. It is manufacturing more artillery shells than all 32 NATO members combined. It is building drones that the US military cannot currently produce at scale. It has systems that the Pentagon wants, needs, and is now prepared to pay for. In this deep dive, we are going to show you how Ukraine quietly became one of the most advanced weapons manufacturers on Earth, why the United States is now the one writing the checks, what this means for Russia's strategy, and why Vladimir Putin is facing a nightmare he never once considered possible when he ordered his tanks across the border in February 2022. Ukraine did not just survive this war. It used this war to build something that changed the global balance of power. And now the tables have turned so completely that America is standing at Ukraine's door, not with a delivery, but with an order form. Cast your mind back to the first weeks of March 2022. Ukraine's President Vladimir Zelensky was standing in the streets of Kyiv making desperate video calls to every world leader he could reach. The message was always the same. Give us weapons. Give us ammunition. Give us anything. His country was facing the second largest military in the world, and its own defense industry was producing roughly $1 billion worth of equipment per year, a fraction of what a single month of this war would consume. The plan at that point was simply to stay alive. Ukraine's military relied on donated Soviet-era equipment from Eastern European allies, a trickle of Western systems arriving weeks late, and whatever could be scraped together from storage facilities across the country. There was no plan to become a manufacturer. There was no vision of becoming an exporter. There was only the immediate, desperate need to hold the line one more day. But something unexpected started happening in the garages, warehouses, and small workshops scattered across Ukraine's cities. Engineers who had been building agricultural machinery, telecommunications equipment, and civilian electronics started repurposing their knowledge. Private companies, startups, and volunteer groups began designing and building drones. Not military-grade, Pentagon-approved drones built over a decade of bureaucratic procurement cycles, but fast, cheap, effective drones built in weeks and tested directly on the battlefield the following morning. The hidden stakes of this transformation were enormous. Ukraine was not just building weapons. It was building an entirely new model of warfare, one where innovation cycles measured in years were compressed into days, where battlefield feedback went directly back to the factory floor, and where a $20 commercial drone component could be turned into a weapon that destroyed a $1 million Russian tank. Western defense analysts warned repeatedly that this model had limits. They said Ukraine could not sustain its own production under constant Russian bombardment. They said the workforce was too small. They said the supply chains were too fragile. They said Ukraine would remain dependent on Western charity indefinitely. Ukraine assumed otherwise. And Ukraine was right. At 9:22 a.m. on April 9, 2025, President Vladimir Zelensky stood before a gathering of journalists in Kyiv and said something that landed like a thunderbolt in every defense ministry in the world. Ukraine, he announced, was prepared to purchase $30 to $50 billion worth of weapons from the United States, not as aid, not as charity, but as a direct commercial transaction. Ukraine would pay. With its own money. For a moment, nobody quite understood what they were hearing. This was not a country asking for handouts. This was a country that had spent 3 years building its own industrial base and now had the economic confidence to become a paying customer of the United States defense sector. Zelensky was not begging. He was negotiating. And while that announcement was sending shockwaves through Washington, something else was also happening simultaneously. Deep inside Ukraine's defense production network, numbers were being compiled that the rest of the world was not yet ready for. Ukraine's Ministry of Strategic Industries confirmed that domestic weapons production capacity had reached $35 billion per year in 2025 and was on track to hit $50 to $55 billion by the end of 2026. This was not a projection. This was factory floor reality. Pause. The scale of what Ukraine had built in 4 years of war is almost impossible to process. In 2022, Ukraine produced exactly one Bodana howitzer, a single prototype. By 2025, the same factory was producing 20 of them every single month, each one delivered in 60 days, each one costing $2.5 million, compared to the $4.3 million price tag and several-year waiting list for comparable Western systems. Ukraine was building better artillery, faster, for less money. While the howitzer numbers were already staggering, the drone production figures were also rewriting history. Ukraine manufactured between 2.5 and 4 million drones in 2025 alone. In 2026, the target is 8 million. The UAV sector grew by 137% in a single year. Unmanned ground vehicle production grew by 488%. Electronic warfare systems grew by 215%. Brave 1, Ukraine's government defense innovation cluster, had processed more than 2,300 manufacturers and 5,000 individual weapon developments. 96% of all drones used by the Ukrainian military were domestically produced. Ukraine had gone from importing Soviet-era junk to building the most battlefield-tested, AI-integrated, mass-produced drone arsenal in human history. And the US military was watching all of this very carefully. Because America has a problem, its own defense procurement system, built around decade-long contracts, legacy manufacturers, and bureaucratic approval chains, cannot produce drones at the scale or speed that modern warfare now demands. Ukraine can, and the Pentagon knows it. According to sources familiar with senior-level discussions inside the Department of Defense in early 2026, a series of closed-door briefings took place in the Pentagon throughout January and February. The subject was not Ukraine's survival. Ukraine's survival was no longer the primary concern. The subject was Ukraine's capability. We have learned from individuals briefed on these sessions that senior U.S. defense officials were presented with a detailed breakdown of Ukraine's drone performance data from the battlefield. Kill rates, jamming resistance, production costs, deployment speed, and adaptability under live fire conditions. The conclusion reached in those briefings was, by all accounts, blunt. Ukraine's battlefield drone ecosystem was more advanced, more scalable, and more cost-effective than anything currently in the U.S. production pipeline at comparable scale. A private meeting took place between senior Pentagon acquisition officials and Ukrainian defense industry representatives in Brussels in February 2026. The participants included officials from U.S. Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, representatives from Ukraine's Ministry of Strategic Industries, and executives from 3 of Ukraine's largest private drone manufacturers. The agenda, described by one source as a capability audit, was essentially the U.S. military asking Ukraine, what can you build, how fast, and what will it cost? Sources say the Ukrainians came prepared. They brought production data, battlefield performance statistics, cost per unit breakdowns, and delivery timelines. They showed a quadcopter drone that could evade Russian jamming systems, fly over 20 kilometers, and drop 6 kilograms of precision-guided explosives for a unit cost that made the Americans in the room go quiet. The calculation inside the Pentagon was cold and clear. The United States could spend years and billions trying to build its own next-generation drone production capacity from scratch. Or it could buy directly from Ukraine, which had already done the hard work, not in a laboratory, but in actual combat against an actual enemy in real time. There was no better testing environment on Earth, and there was no cheaper path to capability. The decision, according to sources close to the process, was not difficult once the numbers were on the table. The Trump administration approved the first $50 million direct commercial arms purchase from Ukraine, and that, as multiple defense insiders described it, was just the opening bid in a relationship that was being redesigned from the ground up. Why is this happening now? Follow the battlefield logic. Modern warfare has changed permanently. The war in Ukraine proved something that defense establishments in Washington, London, and Berlin had been theorizing about for years, but had never truly internalized, that cheap, mass-produced AI-integrated drones have fundamentally replaced artillery as the dominant force on the close battlefield. FPV drones now account for between 80 and 85% of frontline targeting in Ukraine. Russia fires up to 60,000 artillery shells per day, but Ukraine's drone fleet is destroying Russian armor and infantry at a cost-per-kill ratio that conventional weapons simply cannot match. This power shift From expensive, slow, bureaucratically procured legacy systems to fast, cheap, battlefield-adaptive drone warfare is the most important military development of the 21st century. And Ukraine is the only country on Earth that has actually lived it, built for it, and mastered it at industrial scale. The Council on Foreign Relations made this explicit in a February 2026 report. It stated that Ukraine's defense industrial base had become a pillar of Europe's future security and that its innovations in drones, autonomy, electronic warfare, and battlefield software were now strategically valuable beyond Ukraine's borders. The Jamestown Foundation went further, noting that Ukraine now produces more artillery shells than all 32 NATO members combined, and that its defense delivery timelines and cost structures were dramatically superior to equivalent Western systems. For the United States, the historical context is significant. America has not faced a peer-level military adversary that forced rapid battlefield innovation since the Korean War. Its defense procurement system was built for a world where the U.S. had time, money, and technological dominance on its side. That world is no longer guaranteed. China is watching everything that has happened in Ukraine. So is Iran, so is North Korea. And what they are all watching is proof that drone warfare at scale can neutralize advantages that took decades to build. The legal mechanics of the new relationship are already in motion. The Trump administration approved the first direct commercial sale through the Arms Export Control Act. The $50 million initial transaction is structured as a defense commercial sale, a government-to-government framework that could scale to much larger volumes without requiring individual congressional approval for each tranche. Zelensky has proposed the broader $50 billion package be structured through the U.S.-Ukraine Minerals Deal Fund, creating a self-financing loop where Ukrainian rare earth resources generate the revenue that pays for American and Ukrainian weapons purchased by Ukraine and eventually sold back into Western markets. It is one of the most sophisticated reverse dependency arrangements in modern geopolitical history. Here is what the domino effect looks like from here. Ukraine starts selling weapons to the U.S. American defense manufacturers watch their government buy foreign-produced systems at lower cost with faster delivery. Pressure builds on legacy contractors like Lockheed Martin and Raytheon to explain why a country that was under active bombardment 4 years ago is now outperforming them on price and speed. Congressional hearings begin. The U.S. defense procurement model faces its most serious challenge in decades. While that pressure is building inside Washington, something else is also happening across the Atlantic. 10 Ukrainian defense export centers opened across Europe in February 2026. Denmark, Sweden, Canada, Norway, and Iceland committed a combined 1.5 billion euros to finance Ukrainian weapons production for their own militaries. Germany signed a separate undisclosed deal. Britain announced joint production arrangements. The Danish model, where partner governments fund Ukrainian production and receive the weapons in return, is being copied by every defense ministry that ran the numbers. And Putin is watching all of this with a calculation that is becoming increasingly desperate. Russia began this war believing it would shatter Ukraine's industrial capacity within weeks. 3 years later, Ukraine produces more drones than Russia can shoot down, more shells than NATO combined, and is now selling its surplus to the very alliance Russia went to war to weaken. Every Russian missile strike on Ukrainian infrastructure that failed to stop production has effectively funded the expansion of the industry it was trying to destroy. The geopolitical abandonment narrative is also shifting dramatically. Countries that once sympathized with Russia's framing that Ukraine was simply a proxy of Western charity can no longer sustain that argument when Ukraine is signing commercial contracts as a seller. A charity case does not export $55 billion in defense production. A new industrial power does. Inside the Kremlin, sources familiar with Russian strategic planning briefings say that the Ukrainian weapons export development was not anticipated in any of the original war scenarios. Russia planned for a 3-day military operation. It did not plan for Ukraine to become a defense exporter. It did not plan for Ukraine to become the country that teaches the world how to fight cheap, fast, and smart. And it certainly did not plan for the United States to become Ukraine's customer. Reports from analysts tracking Russian state communications describe a leadership that is visibly struggling with how to frame this development publicly. State television has largely gone silent on Ukraine's industrial transformation. The gap between what Russian media told its citizens this war would look like and what it has actually produced is now so large that acknowledging Ukraine's weapons sales would require admitting that the entire premise of the war was a catastrophic miscalculation. The $50 billion figure is not just a number. It is the symbol of the most complete reversal of fortune in modern military history. 3 years ago, Ukraine was on its knees, calling every phone number it had, begging for old equipment from foreign warehouses. Today it is sitting across the table from Pentagon procurement officials with a catalog, a price list, and a delivery schedule. You can invade a country. You can bomb its cities. You can try to crush its economy. But you cannot bomb an idea. And the idea that Ukraine proved that necessity drives innovation faster than any procurement budget ever could is now worth $50 billion and counting. So where does this leave us today? Vladimir Putin sits in the Kremlin having launched a war that was supposed to erase Ukraine as a meaningful strategic actor. Instead, he created the most battle-hardened, technologically advanced, and cost-efficient defense industry in the world. He is now facing a Ukraine that does not just survive, it sells. He is facing a United States that is not just a donor to Ukraine's cause, but a paying customer of Ukraine's capability. He is facing a Europe that is embedding Ukrainian weapons production into its own security architecture. He started this war to weaken the West's interest in Ukraine. He ended up making Ukraine indispensable to it. As we move into the second half of 2026, watch for 3 things. First, watch whether the $50 billion framework gets formally structured into a multi-year procurement agreement between Washington and Kyiv. That would be the moment Ukraine formally joins the tier of major U.S. defense suppliers. Second, watch Russia's response if Ukraine begins exporting long-range strike drones to U.S. allies in the Pacific. That changes the entire equation around Taiwan and the South China Sea. Third, watch Zelensky's diplomatic schedule. A leader who is now meeting defense ministers as a seller, not a petitioner, operates from a completely different position of strength. The story everyone thought they understood about this war is over. Ukraine was not supposed to become a weapons power. It was not supposed to outlast, outbuild, and outpace one of the largest military machines on Earth. It was not supposed to sit across from the United States as a supplier. But it did. And the $50 billion being discussed right now is not charity. It is not aid. It is not sympathy. It is a receipt. Subscribe and stay close. We will be tracking the formal structure of the U.S.-Ukraine defense procurement deal as it develops, and the moment the first major export contract is signed, we will break it down in full. This is not just a weapons story. This is the story of how a war meant to erase a country instead wrote that country permanently into the future of global power. Watch closely. The tables have not just turned. They have been flipped entirely.